Jon Frederickson, welcome back to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Well, I believe this is the third time that I've had you on the show, and you're one of my favorite guests because your books are so deep and authoritative in their treatment of intensive short-term dynamic psychotherapy, or ISTDP. I have trouble getting all of that out sometimes. Thank goodness it's got an abbreviation, but I struggle even with that. So today we're going to be discussing your latest book, the title of which is Co-Creating Safety, Healing the Fragile Patient. What led you to writing this particular book at this particular time?
Well, it's interesting. When I first started out as a therapist, I was working in a clinic with very disturbed people. And a lot of times I'd be bringing these cases to supervision, and I'd be told, well, this person isn't really treatable, or this person really isn't suitable for psychotherapy. But there was a problem. These people wanted psychotherapy, and they were showing up in my office, and they needed help.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of bias at that time. It's almost 40 years ago when I started out, where someone heard voices or hallucinated some, or if they'd had a psychotic break, or if they'd really been quite dysfunctional, there was generally an assumption that these people weren't treatable. Yeah. And over time, I was fortunate to get supervision with certain people who could help me. And it really became kind of a cause célèbre, I guess you could say, for me. I really eventually wanted to write a book on how do you work with people that are much more fragile, and that it's not enough to say they're not treatable. The question is, oftentimes, when someone says a patient's not treatable, it just means that therapist wasn't able to treat them. So I've always hesitated to say anybody is not treatable. If I wasn't successful with a patient, all it meant was I didn't succeed, but I've always been convinced somebody else could.
Yeah.
And so I was lucky to have some good supervisors along the way that could help me. Many who'd worked up at Chestnut Lodge, in the tradition of Harry Sack Sullivan. And I'd always wanted to put this together in some kind of coherent way where people could really learn how to understand a lot of troubling behavior, troubling symptoms, hallucinations, delusions, and all kinds of phenomena like this from a psychological perspective, so that therapists would have a way of really understanding phenomena that oftentimes seem very puzzling and not understandable.
Yeah, and I think it was in the first chapter or the introduction, maybe they're one and the same, where you talked about a patient who was saying he was going to kill you, he was going to murder you. So that's an extreme example.
Yeah. That actually, a patient didn't threaten me, but he threatened another therapist. But actually, no, I've had a couple of examples of that. Actually,
okay. Yeah.
But we oftentimes think that I'm really in danger, not realizing actually the patient is afraid we're going to kill them. And so when a patient threatens to kill us, that means he's frightened. And a lot of times we forget, if a patient threatens us in a way and we're feeling frightened, that means he's frightened and he's feeling threatened by us. What am I doing that might be threatening this patient? Yeah. And there's an example in there where a patient actually brings a gun in and puts it on
I remember the there was something very dramatic that happened.
Right? And the therapist, had the sense to say, you must be really anxious and frightened. Tell me about it. And the patient calmed down and told him what he was frightened about.
Wow. So we probably should define our terms a little bit, because in the title is the term, the fragile patient. So tell us about the fragile patient. I think we've jumped in right away in the deep end here.
Sure. Well, we have sort of an intuitive understanding of it. Any therapist that hears the term fragile patient can easily think of someone they think of that way. In the book, I think of it not just as a metaphor, but actually as something we can actually define very specifically. So a fragile patient is someone whose anxiety gets so high that instead of tensing up or even getting sick to the stomach, they have physical symptoms where they actually get blurry vision, they get ringing in the ears, they have trouble, they just literally have trouble thinking, their thinking gets disorganized, and where they look really slumped or they look really flat because there's just no tension in the body. And so in terms of their anxiety is really very, very high.
And it's
And
kind of like they've left the room
yep,
psychically,
yep,
huh? Yeah.
exactly. And that's one of the defenses, of course, that when patients are feeling so much anxiety that overwhelms them, yes, oftentimes they will leave the room, they'll dissociate, or they'll literally leave the room. Patients may get up and run out of the office. The first case I present in the book is a guy who ran out of my office to the elevator. Something I said made him anxious, and I had to
Yeah.
run after him and hold the elevator door open and then talk to him a little bit until he could make his way back to the office.
Yeah. Wow.
So, so these are
And so,
patients where they have
yeah.
trouble tolerating feelings inside. So they send them outside. So if I can't tolerate a feeling inside, I'll project it outside. So I might think my therapist is angry with me. I'll project my anger on the therapist. Or I forget that I have questions I want to ask because I'm coming to therapy, and I might project and be afraid of the questions the therapist wants to ask.
Mhm.
So the patients like this, they engage in the defenses we call splitting and then projection, because they literally have trouble tolerating feelings inside, so they place them outside. And then as a result, they tend to be chronically afraid of other people, or they'll be really angry of the projections they place on people. So if I
Yeah.
think that you're angry or that you want to attack me, yes, I would be really angry at you, but I'd really be angry at a projection I have
Yeah.
on you.
Now, this may be really obvious based on what you've already said, but why is safety such a big issue in these cases?
Well, there's two things. One is we want to regulate anxiety so that it's at a reasonable level, right? Anytime we face something we usually avoid, it's going to make us anxious. And that's why Dan Siegel came up with this window of tolerance. He wasn't saying patients shouldn't be anxious, but he said, if you're just engaging in chit chat, there's no anxiety because you're not helping the patient face what they need to face. At the same time, if their anxiety is too high, they can't benefit from therapy. So the therapy has to feel safe enough that the patient is feeling some anxiety, but not too much. And so you need to have the patient really feel safe in their body, anxiety wise, so that it's really safe to explore. And the second element is that when these patients, they tend to project. So they'll say like, what are you trying to do to me? Or where's this
Mhm.
therapy going? So what questions are you going to ask? Or so what's going to happen in this therapy? They're projecting on the therapist. And so they're not going to feel safe with the projection. In general, therapists are very safe people to be with. But if a patient projects images onto you, the patient actually can't feel safe with you because they're interacting with a projection. So you
Yeah.
need to deactivate those projections. Like if a patient says, "What are you looking for?" they're going to be afraid of what you're looking for. So you need to deactivate the projection and say, "Well, I actually have no right to look for anything here unless there's something you want to look for that you think would be helpful to you." So
Hmm.
before we even look at anything, what is it that you would like to look for here in the therapy that you think would be helpful to you? That you
Yeah.
have to deactivate the projections so the patient's in connection to you rather than interacting with the projection. Then they'll feel safe with you.
You have a section on suffering, and is there something uh, uniquely uh, unique about the suffering of the fragile patient?
Absolutely. First of all, these are patients who've usually been traumatized. So they were exposed to way too much anxiety repeatedly early on. So their body is chronically anxious. So when they
Mhm.
come to us, they're almost always way too anxious. When you inquire, you discover that patients were tempted to cancel a session before they came. They'll tell you that if you ask, you learn some of them actually threw up before the session. When they see you, and you ask, you'll learn that they're feeling sick to their stomach right away in the session. They're really suffering physically from anxiety. And the other kind of suffering they have is that if they chronically believe people are going to hurt them, they live in a hostile universe, a very frightening universe. So they're going to constantly be suffering just because they chronically feel in danger, because they're interacting with all these projections.
Okay. And does diagnosis come into this at all? Because you're talking about people who sound their fragility is manifesting, in pretty extreme ways. And so, do you find that you're formulating a traditional diagnosis in your mind at all in this process? And does that cause you to steer one way or another, or not?
Well, that is such an interesting question, because although we say we diagnose people, what we mean is that we've given them a list of symptoms. In the DSM-5, if someone has 5 out of 8 symptoms, we say, okay, they have this diagnosis,
Yeah.
right? And so really, actually in medicine, diagnosis is different. In diagnosis, they want to know what symptoms you have so they can see what's causing the symptoms. So in real diagnosis, you diagnose the cause of the symptoms. In psychotherapy, what we call diagnosis is really listening to the symptoms, but not figuring out what causes them.
Uh-huh.
And so as a result, what we have today, as you know, research shows that our psychological diagnoses are not statistically reliable nor valid. And this
Yeah,
is a
I've even long ago as a graduate student, I was always uncomfortable with that aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. I
Yeah.
remember in my own training, I was like you, I asked my teacher, so what difference does it make? And
Yeah.
she really didn't have an answer, because if you just have a list of symptoms, it doesn't tell you what's causing them. So it doesn't tell you, what are we really going to treat?
Yeah.
So in a way, there people could have any of a number of diagnoses, but here we're trying to look at, okay, where is their anxiety discharged? How do we regulate that anxiety? And then when they're using splitting projection, how do we restructure? How do we help them own inside what they place outside? And when they use denial, how do we help them with denial so they can face reality and their feelings rather than deny painful realities in their life?
And how do you help them manage their anxiety? Because you pointed out that seems to be a major dynamic that's going on with them.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's shocking to me is that early in my training, of course, I read about anxiety and I knew about it some, but I didn't really learn how to regulate it as well as I might have. And I also didn't know about different severities of anxiety in the body. That
Mm.
was something I learned later in my career. And I think still in our field, we tend to underestimate the importance of regulating anxiety. And I'd say about 2/3 of our patients actually need some anxiety regulation and management. So for regulating anxiety, first thing if a patient reports feeling anxious, I'll just say, are you aware of feeling anxious? And then where do you notice feeling this anxiety physically in your body? And then I'll be very curious if their anxiety, if they're sighing a lot, if they get tensed up, if I see them clenching their hands, things like that. I'll see, okay, your anxiety is in what we call the voluntary muscles, somatic nervous system. So this is a patient that can tolerate feelings at a high level. We don't need to worry. Some patients have anxiety, what we call the smooth muscles. These muscles line the digestive system and our blood vessels. So when anxiety goes into the smooth muscles, these patients will report feeling a little sick to their stomach, a nausea. Some report having vomited at times. These are patients that oftentimes have to go to the bathroom suddenly. They may suffer from irritable bowel syndrome or Crohn's disease, and they will suffer from migraine headaches. And these are all anxiety symptoms that we want to find out about. And oftentimes when we tell patients, oh, that sickness in your stomach, yeah, that's a sign of anxiety, they'll oftentimes say, gee, I didn't know that. I thought it was just something I ate, even though it was happening every day.
Yeah, that's one of the things I was wondering about is it sounds like your approach is at times somewhat didactic. Am I right that you really want the patient to understand what's going on
Oh,
in
yeah.
their body and also between you two?
Absolutely. I think it's really important that it's a shared, we're working together,
Yeah.
and I want to make sure the patient understands what we're doing, why we're doing it. Yeah. Would it make sense, for instance, would it make sense to find out what you're feeling so you wouldn't have to be depressed instead? Shall we look underneath that depression and see what it might be covering up?
Yeah.
Questions
Yeah.
like this to help orient the patient. I think a lot of times we just assume a patient knows what therapy is and they should just go along with us. But that makes patients very anxious. What am I getting into? Why is
Yeah.
he
Right.
asking this question? And you really want patients to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. Does this goal make sense to them? Does this task make sense to them? Of course, orientation is one of our basic needs. And I think it's important that, especially with fragile patients, that this really is guided by their will and their understanding.
That's interesting. That leads into the next question I was going to ask you was about the role of will, because you talk about, I'm trying to remember the specific thing. You talked about, there were two things that had to do with will. I've got some questions here. We'll probably get there, but talk to us about will.
Sure, sure. Well, one of the things that everybody is aware of is that when patients have been quite disturbed, they're usually patients that suffered quite a bit of trauma earlier in life. And one of the things that we see in trauma is that someone says, I don't care what you want, I want to physically abuse you. I don't care what you want, I want to sexually abuse you. I don't care what you want, I want to verbally abuse you. Right? So the child is getting this message that his or her will really doesn't matter. So these patients have really an underdeveloped sense of will, and they will kind of passively follow you because they've learned I should just go along with what an authority figure wants. But when they just follow us, their anxiety might get too high. So in a way, one of the ways we restructure this relational response to trauma is to just ask, would you like to take a look at this issue? Would you like to take a look at this feeling? Do I have your permission to help you regulate your anxiety so we could help you feel calmer? So we are really constantly giving the patient the message that their will is driving the therapy, not our will.
Yeah, and what the thing that I was reaching for was you've got a section called declaring a problem and then later declaring one's will. And so
Yeah.
what is it about declaration that's important here?
Oh, because a patient might say that he has a problem, but when you start to explore it, you realize he's not really working together with you. He's just kind of sitting there passively, not really engaging together with you. So at that point, it's really important. You mentioned you have this problem. Is it your will to work on that together here with me? And that's a way for us to find out, is it his will? Oftentimes patients say, well, do you think I should? Or my wife said I should, right? And then we realize that it's like they're projecting their will onto the therapist or onto their wife.
Yeah,
You
I'm
know,
aware of how carefully you are to continually assure them that they're in a safe space by by checking in with them and saying, what do you want now? And are you good with what, with where we're going? And that seems to be a really distinctive characteristic of this approach.
Absolutely. I was just supervising a case the other day, and it's a drug rehab unit where we're doing some research. And, there's some question, is this patient motivated, right?
Yeah, always, yeah.
Right. And so the therapist asks, would you like us to take a look at what's driving this addiction? And the patient says, and after 4 questions, yes, he says, well, my wife thinks I should. My parents think I should be here. My drug counselor at the clinic said that I should be here. And then my probation officer, he said I should be here. And I said, you have a highly motivated patient. I mean, there's so much motivation. He has to send it off to live in 4 different people. When you realize, like, he can't tolerate his will inside, so he has to place it there, and there. I said, it's sort of like someone has a car, but they claim they don't. They say, oh, it's in my girlfriend's garage, or it's in my parents' garage, but it's not in his garage.
Yeah.
So in this way, actually, we almost never have an unmotivated patient. But for many patients, they've learned it's really dangerous to say what they want. Maybe they had a tyrannical father, right? Or a tyrannical mother. And they learned, I shouldn't say what I want. So these patients will oftentimes deny that it's their will. But if we pay attention to where they project, that's where we see their will is actually secretly located.
Yeah.
And then,
just to take a little step back, I have the impression that this book is targeted at therapists rather than clients.
That's right. It is targeted for therapists. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And,
but I did write it in a way that I hope that, if patients did read it, that they would find it informative.
Yeah. Yeah. And that they wouldn't find themselves being blamed for their condition or something like that.
No, I wrote it with the idea that a patient could read this book and feel understood.
Yeah.
Because in a way, we need to speak to patients in a way they feel understood. So if I'm reaching out to therapists, wanting them to speak in a way that patients would be understood, I wanted to write it in a way that patients would feel understood. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why I kept saying these patients have to project, right? They have only a certain amount of tolerance of feeling inside, and whatever goes beyond their capacity has to get projected out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so you're very careful not to blame the patient for their symptoms, but rather get them to view their symptoms in terms of a system of self-protection.
That's right.
Which is natural and understandable.
That's the key thing, that it's an understandable response to how they experience early relationships.
Yeah. If I were in your shoes, I would be having the same thing going on.
Exactly. And it's how we experience a relationship, because there's how the child is, there's the parent, and then it's also genetics. There's temperament, right? There can be neurocognitive deficits. All these things can interact to create a particular experience. And so for us as therapists to realize whatever's happening here may not be a photograph of the past, but it's a photograph of how all these forces come together.
Yeah.
I think it's important also not to be caught up in blaming parents as all bad, because that would be another form of splitting. But to recognize that when we're doing our best, that if you have a parent that has had their own traumas, and you have a child that's got a temperament that doesn't fit the parent, or neurocognitive deficits, they're unfortunate interactions that can occur that can shape a child's life.
Yeah. So the part of the in the title of the ISDTP, whatever, is D is for dynamic, and
Mm-hmm.
dynamic is for psychodynamic.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a lot of history around all of that. So I'm wondering
Mm-hmm.
about what's the role of the unconscious in this work?
The role of the unconscious. Well, first of all, there are usually feelings coming up of which the patient is unaware, which is unconscious. And then the patient is anxious, but they're not aware of their anxiety oftentimes. They're not aware that the stomach, being sick to the stomach is anxiety. They're not aware that blurry vision or ringing in the ears is a sign of anxiety. They're not aware of problems thinking or blanking out are signs of anxiety. So in that way, anxiety is unconscious, and we have to make that conscious for the patient so they together we can regulate their anxiety. And defenses, it's not like patients wake up in the morning and say, I really feel like projecting when I see David today. you know these defenses happen
Yeah.
automatically outside the patient's awareness, so the patient has no idea they're splitting or using denial or projecting. This is very important for therapists to see. Patients don't know they're projecting, and it's not intentional. It's happening outside their awareness. And since patients don't see how they're projecting, they naturally are unconscious, not only defense, they're unconscious that their suffering is a logical consequence of those defenses.
One of the things that you write about is strengthening the patient.
Yeah.
How is that possible? How do you strengthen a patient?
Well, first of all, just regulating their anxiety, helping them regulate their anxiety. And then we explore feelings in situations, feelings that they usually avoid. And we help them start to bear by exploring feelings. We explore feelings with them, building their capacity to tolerate feelings inside rather than project them outside. And then when these patients start to get have cognitive perceptual disruption, when they have these feelings rise, then we'll regulate their anxiety with each rise of feelings. And each time, then they're able to tolerate a little bit more feeling before they have anxiety problems. And so we're just building the capacity to tolerate feelings inside so they don't have to project outside. So that by the end of therapy, hopefully, they can tolerate their feelings without resorting to projection or splitting. And then as a result, then the relationships can be much more realistic and much more healthy.
Yeah, I suspect that my next question is buried in what you just have been talking about, which is you write about the hierarchy of affect thresholds, and of course,
Mm-hmm.
affect means feelings, and you've
Mm-hmm,
just been
mm-hmm.
talking but what's the hierarchy? Where,
Yeah, what it means is that although there's well over 100 defenses, there's different ways that patients have learned to protect other people in relationships. And so you can have some people where when feelings come up, they intellectualize. They say, well, it's a difficult situation. If you ask what their feeling is, they'll intellectualize that. I think it's a difficult situation. They might rationalize. And I say, well, I think the reason he did that was because. That would be rationalization. So patients that have a high level of tolerance of feelings usually will be able to isolate affect. In other words, they can intellectualize or rationalize, so that then when you ask them what they feel, they might say angry, sad, happy. But you notice the word is isolated from the feeling. It's not like a person says, I'm angry. He says, angry. He won't say, I'm sad. He'll say, sad. He won't say, I'm happy. He'll say, I'm happy. So the word is isolated from the experience. But
uh-huh.
that's because their ability to detach from feelings is very good. So in that way, people who have a high level of affect tolerance, they can detach from their feelings quite effectively. But that also means we can explore feelings at very high levels. So patients that have less affect tolerance, maybe they can intellectualize a little bit, but then as feelings rise, their anxiety moves into the smooth muscles, And then these are the patients that become very depressed and sad. They suffer from anxiety in the smooth muscles, and you'll see them engage in a lot of self-criticism, self-attack, where they get really depressed. You'll see them have, these are patients who have somatic symptoms. These are patients that maybe their body goes numb, or they start to lose access, like suddenly their legs or arms don't function in the session. That's unusual, but we have patients like that. But these are patients where they protect the people they love by turning anger on themselves. So
Okay.
the people in isolation of affect and detachment feelings, people in the second group, they say, I love you, I just hate myself. They might say, well, you're a good therapist. Maybe I just can't do this kind of therapy, or I must be the worst patient you have, or I'm sorry, it's all my fault. So they protect you from mixed feelings by saying, I like you, but I turn all the anger on myself.
Okay.
And then you have the fragile patients where when they have mixed feelings, when they're angry with someone they love, they can't tolerate that complexity. So what they do is they have to split those two, when those feelings rise, of love of anger towards someone they love. When those feelings rise, these patients really get very anxious, and so they split the feelings off, and then they'll say, I think you're angry with me. So the
Mhm.
anger will get projected out, and they'll view other people as very dangerous. And that way,
Yeah.
they are not the possessor of this so-called bad feeling.
Yeah.
The
And
problem is then they become afraid of all those people.
when we started, you were talking about the patients that therapists did not want to deal with because, they might be psychotic.
Mhm.
Uh, and you've got a chapter on pseudo hallucinations and pseudo delusions.
Yeah,
What makes them pseudo, and how do you tell the difference?
that's a great question. So the interesting thing is, so we tend to talk about delusions and hallucinations as if it's a unitary phenomenon. And we
Yeah.
just assume, oh, this is a psychotic person. But in fact, in psychodynamic therapy, we have a way of determining whether someone is at a psychotic level of character structure or at a borderline level of character structure where we could really do some good treatment. And so, what you do is, suppose a person hears a voice, and so then you work with them on the voice. So there's an example in there where a student of mine was doing some group therapy at a drug rehab setting, and a patient became quite disrupted in the group and suddenly was hearing voices. So the therapist asked, these voices are a sign of anxiety. Do I have your permission to regulate your anxiety so we could help it come down? And this woman said, "Don't take away my voices. Don't take away my voices." And right, which meant she wanted someone to take her voices away. So the therapist deactivated the projection. She says, "Well, I have no right to take away your voices. And even if I could, I don't have a right to, because these are your voices. And if these voices are helpful to you, you have an obligation to hold on to these voices."
Mhm.
And the patient began to cry and said, finally, somebody understands me.
Wow.
Now, in that situation, this patient, through that deactivation of projection, could drop her voices, because voices are a form of projection. What we can't tolerate inside, we'll place outside in a voice. It's just a primitive form of projection. But this patient, through the therapist's work, let go of the hallucination and was able to tolerate the feelings that the hallucination had been warding off. As a result, we would call that a pseudo hallucination because it's something that resolved when the therapist began to work with that.
Hmm.
So, and the same thing can happen with delusions. A person may have a particular delusion. I gave an example of a woman who had a delusion that she had that she had sat on a stove and been and burned, and she was suddenly having a manic episode. So her mother brought her into my office, and her mother saying, "This is ridiculous. This didn't happen." and the woman is talking about how she was burned when she sat on the stove. And then I remembered, oh, right, she was going to visit her boyfriend. So I just asked out of the blue, I said, so I remember last time we spoke, you were talking about your boyfriend. How are things there? And she said, he dumped me. And I said, oh, you got burned.
Good.
And she cleared
Yeah.
up, right? She
Yeah.
cleared up. So that would be an example of a pseudo delusion, that
Yeah.
it's something that responds to interpretation. It responds to when you work with splitting or projection. And so in that way, someone that you might think is untreatable because they have to present with a delusion or hallucination, when we work with them, there's a sizable group of these people that will respond well, and that we see actually this is someone who's quite treatable. And so we would differentiate that from someone who's at a psychotic level of character structure. When you have someone at a psychotic level of character structure and you address their hallucinations and delusions, they'll oftentimes become far more anxious. Their reality testing will get worse, and they'll start to get quite disorganized, and they'll start to hallucinate and become even more delusional and more bizarre, with more bizarre content. This is something. Go ahead. This is something that Kernberg talks about, in the sense that when we address these psychotic symptoms, that there's a group where the reality testing gets better, which is the group I'm talking about in the book, and then you have this group where the reality testing gets worse, and they're at a psychotic level of character structure.
It's reminding me of a therapist from years ago. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but I'm blocking on his name. It might be Rosen, who talked about direct therapy.
Oh, yes. Rosen, yes, direct therapy, right.
Yeah. And so his approach was very psychoanalytic, but instead of couching it in some other indirect approach, he would just speak very directly to the fears and hallucinations that the patients were having. And his approach often would sound kind of bizarre, but he's speaking to them, and he's speaking to their unconscious in a way, in a very direct way that was shocking. And that's what I like about the and I get the letters scrambled, the order ISTDP, I think, is that it builds on the psychodynamic understanding, everything that we've learned about the unconscious, about what's going on in the unconscious, about the defensive systems and so on.
Right.
But it builds on it, but it's very but it's so permissive in some ways, it's the way that you're just in your voice and your whole manner, you're creating a very safe environment and a very permissive environment. And so, and also in that title is something about short term, that I think that this is
no, I didn't mention anything about short term.
Okay, is this not short term?
Well, because when you're working with patients like this, things aren't going to be totally resolved in 20 sessions, right?
Yeah.
So I would think of it as time efficient, but definitely not short term, because patients who are this disturbed, easily you could see them for 150 sessions or more.
Okay, where I was picking that up is I believe the ISTDP stands for Intensive Short-Term Dynamic Psychotherapy.
That's right. Okay. But even within that community, we recognize that when the more disturbed the patient, the longer the therapy needs to be.
It's going to take time. Yeah.
That's a research finding that you find across all therapy modalities. It's obvious. The more troubled the patient is, the longer the therapy needs to be. I had a supervisor years ago, was a wonderful man, an analyst named Harold Eist, and he had this great metaphor. He said, they're all saying the therapy should be done within 10 or 15 sessions, but what would happen if the United States government said that all bridges should be 15 feet long? Right. It's like
Uh-huh.
we all can think of very short bridges in town and
Yeah,
longer bridges, and then bridges that are a mile long. You know, and so
yeah,
I really, if you think of therapy as a bridge, some patients need a much longer bridge, and there's nothing
yeah,
wrong with your therapy if it requires a longer bridge.
yeah.
We tend to forget that the level of disturbance, it's going to be a longer therapy, and that people need a longer bridge. And there's no shame in giving patients the time they need for this organic process to unfold.
Well, that makes sense to me. And it also takes some of the pressure off of therapists to feel that they have to do some godly intervention that would magically heal years and years of deeply embedded behavior
Exactly.
and
Well, and
affect.
even more importantly, it takes pressure off the patient.
Yeah.
I've had patients that come to me and people are trying to push all kinds of stuff to happen in 10
Uh-huh.
sessions. It simply can't happen
Yeah.
in 10 sessions. And then they're terrified, like everything has to happen between us within 10 sessions or 6 months. And in a way, we really have to talk about, no, this is going to be it's going to be a longer
Uh-huh.
therapy, right?
Yeah.
And your experience shows that, right? And there's a big relief to the patient when we can just be honest, when we have a bigger
Right.
job. It's going to take longer.
Well, I've sort of run out of questions, but I'm wondering, is there any more that you feel would be good to get out into this interview?
Yeah, I think two things is that with this group of patients, like with my title, it's co-creating safety. Um, but to really understand that patients need to feel safe in their body in order safe to explore. And we tend not to focus enough on how patients experience anxiety in the body. It'll really make all the difference in the world so that people who read the book will learn how to assess anxiety in the body. And just if they only read the anxiety chapter alone, they're going to be making patients feel safe in the body, and it's going to make it a much easier journey. You want patients to feel some anxiety, not too little, not too much. And in this book, it talks about what's that optimal level of anxiety, so you can really titrate your work for that. And
Yeah.
the other thing is, although I knew about projection, I heard about projection when I was starting as a therapist, there really was very little said about how to identify it, how to work with it. And with this kind of patient, there's so many kinds of projections that it's really important to be able to understand and read what those projections are. Because if we don't deactivate the projection, the patient is going to be interacting with the projection instead of relating to you. And very, very often we have these kind of subtle misalliances that can go on for quite a while in the treatment because the therapist just doesn't understand what that projection is. Just yesterday, I supervised a case in Poland, and there was a patient who was projecting her will onto the therapist, assumed that the therapist wanted to look at certain issues and that the therapist was concerned about her difficulties. And I pointed out that the patient was just waiting for the therapist to guide the process. And then the patient herself was a little bit afraid and angry at this therapist who she thought was driving the therapy. So in a way, she just had to say, I have no right to look at anything here unless it's something you'd like to look at for your own benefit. And so we need to find out what you would like to look at here that you think would be helpful to you. And that you might have to do that for 10, 20, maybe even more minutes until the patient really can declare what they want and that the therapy now starts to be guided by the patient's will. It's really important to remember that it has to be the patient's will driving the therapy. It can't be your will.
And
Otherwise,
I would imagine that it's going to keep coming back around to that. It's not like you can communicate that just once.
exactly. Well, and I'm so glad you brought that up because, in a sense, what you're helping the listeners see is you and I are talking about therapy. Now, but when students assume that if they just deal with something, that it's gone forever, that's not therapy. That's called magic. And that happens in some other building and on some other podcast. But this
Yeah.
is the therapy podcast, not the magic podcast. In magic, yes, we wish that some magical intervention would have magical power and the patient's problems about will would disappear, or that after this session, the patient would no longer project. That's magic. But
I
we,
think that I remember back when I was a student, you would read these case histories by well-known psychotherapists,
Mhm.
and so you'd have in your mind this image of the perfect therapist.
Yeah, yeah. And that perfect therapist never failed, always knew what to do, and his interventions just had this magical power. And
Yeah,
then you start working, you think, where's the magic?
yeah. Well, I
And
really appreciate the way that that your work and others that are aligned with this approach. That over time it's become very nuanced, and
Mhm,
it's not throwing away all of the wisdom and learning of the past, but rather fine tuning it.
mhm,
And I like your closing view about the value of this book, as I understand it, is
mhm.
that it's going to help fine tune for therapists some of the interventions that they make.
Absolutely, so that you can provide the kind of a safe environment that would make it possible for a patient to do therapy.
Well, Jon Frederickson, I want to thank you for being my guest today, and you've helped to fine tune my own understanding. And I look forward to speaking with you again. I know this is not going to be the last time we speak.
Thank you so much, Dave. It's a wonderful chance to speak to you again.